Distributed Database System, presented by Rupali Banerjee. Today our topic is Transaction in Distributed Management System. What is transaction? What is asset property? What is the utility of transaction? Everything we already learned from our DBMS class. Now, today we will learn how transaction is done in case of Distributed Database Management System. In case of centralized database system, there it is mandatory to perform any transaction under the satisfaction of which property? Asset property, that is atomicity, consistency, isolation and durability. We already learned. And in case of centralized database, it is mandatory. But in case of distributed database, yes. In case of distributed database, the act of preserving the asset property for any transaction is also mandatory here. In case of distributed transaction, there are two types based on the location of access data. What is that? The first one is local transaction. Local transaction means everything is done in local database. That is, local transaction involve read, write or update of data in only local database. And another one is global transaction. Here, global transaction involve read, write or update of data in many such local databases. Transaction system. Distributed database transaction system has two important components. First one is transaction manager. In case of centralized database, there is one transaction manager. But in case of distributed database, there are more than one transaction manager. For every site, there is one transaction manager. What is the job of this transaction manager? The main job of this transaction manager is to verify the asset properties of those transactions executed at that particular site. Next component is transaction coordinator. Transaction coordinator is available for every site in distributed database. The job of this transaction coordinator is to manage and coordinate various transactions that is initiated at that site. Transaction manager manages and coordinates various transactions both if the transaction is local or the transaction is global. Both transaction is managed and coordinated by this transaction coordinator. So, each transaction manager is responsible for maintaining a log for recovery purpose. They maintain one log, means in case of transaction, if there is any failure occurs, then it is the responsibility of transaction manager to maintain that log to recover the whole transaction process. And second one is participating in an appropriate concurrency control scheme to coordinate the concurrent execution of the transaction executing at that site. That is, concurrency control is also done by transaction manager. That is, if there are two or more transactions done concurrently, then this concurrency control is done by transaction manager. And what is the responsibility of transaction coordinator? Transaction coordinator is responsible for starting the transaction of every site. Means what? Every site has its own transaction coordinator and each transaction coordinator starts the execution of that particular site. Another important thing is transaction coordinator first break the transaction into a number of sub-transactions and distribute these sub-transactions to the appropriate site for execution. Means see, in the diagram, transaction coordinator for this site, transaction coordinator 1, send the transaction to transaction manager 2. Transaction coordinator 1, send the transaction to transaction manager 3. In this way, a particular site transaction coordinator send the transaction to different sites and then they mention the distribution of sub-transaction to the concerned transaction manager. In this way, the transaction is distributed and this is done by transaction coordinator. Types of questions comes in your university exam. Now, our next topic is various transaction models. First, general model. When read and write actions are performed without any specific ordering, then that type of model is called general model. Next, two-step model. If the transactions are restricted so that all read operations are performed before any write operation, then that model is called two-step model. And what is restricted model? If the transaction is restricted so that a data item has to be read before it can be written or updated, that model is called restricted model. So first you have to read the data item, then you can update or you can write. That type of model is called restricted model. If a transaction is both two-step and restricted, then that model is called restricted two-step model. And the last one is action model. Action model of transaction which consists of restricted class with the further restriction that each read-write pair be executed atomically. Means read a particular data item, then write that. Again read another data item, then write that. It should be one pair and be executed atomically. Distributed transaction. When we can call a transaction is a distributed transaction. When a client transaction invokes operation in several different servers, then that transaction is called distributed transaction. There are two different ways. One is flat transaction, another is nested transactions. In a flat transaction, a client makes requests to more than one server. So this is our client machine and it makes requests to more than one server. A flat transaction completes each of its requests before going on to the next one. So first it completes first one request, then the second one, then the third one. That is a flat transaction complete each of its requests before going to the second one. So here sequential access to the object is done. Nested transaction. In case of nested transaction, first the top level transaction can open sub-transaction. See, T1 can open sub-transaction T11, T12, T2 can open sub-transactions T21, T22. And each sub-transaction can open further sub-transaction. Sub-transaction at the same level can run concurrently. If they are in the same level, that is T1, T2 can run concurrently. T11, T12 can run concurrently. If they are in the same level, they can run concurrently. Arranged in labels, top level can open sub-transaction. So they are arranged in label and top level can open sub-transaction. Here any depth of nesting is possible. That is, each transaction can have sub-transaction. Each sub-transaction can have again sub-transactions in this way. Any depth of nesting is possible. Objects in different servers can be invoked in parallel. If they are in same level, they can invoked in parallel. Here, better performance we can achieve. Types of questions comes in your university exam. Go through this question. For getting more and more updates, please like, share and subscribe my channel. That's all for today. Thank you.